Hi, I'm Andrea Davis, the lead game designer on Gods Unchained, and joining me today is Kelly Diggs, the narrative consultant for Gods Unchained story going past and going forward. Kelly, I'm so excited to be able to do the stream with you today.
I worked at Wizards of the Coast for 11 and a half years, I believe. I worked there in many different capacities. I worked on the website. I was an editor on the cards for a while, which was a lot of fun and gave me a very different perspective than a lot of people had. But then for the last 5 years or so, I was on the creative team, the story and world building team for the game. So that's really the meat of my experience with them.
So, talk a little bit about how you came to take all of the pieces that we had set out in the first year of the product and use that as a synthesis to build something new going forward.
So the two things that I identified as really the core of the existing Gods Unchained lore were the gods and the tribes, were the two things that I really zeroed in on. Is like, okay, these exist. The idea is that there have been other cosmoses before this one, that the cosmos exists, and it has these six gods who are in charge of it, each has their domain, and the notion is that the domains are eternal, but the gods maybe aren't.
I wanted to spend a minute or more talking about the gods in particular, both your reimagining of them and how we put them in alliance and opposition to each other, and how that becomes the basis of our storytelling for the next year and beyond.
So one of the ideas, that was in there from the beginning was this idea that these six domains interrelate and overlap and mix to form everything that is. That was already in there, and I liked that the six gods need each other because that's where existence comes from.
Right.
I wanted to get away from the idea that gods are powered by belief. I wanted to avoid that, not get into that. But no, these gods are real. They really exist. They take their power from these domains that exist in the world. There is nature. Nature exists. Death exists. It's a thing, and because it exists, it is personified. The six gods need each other. They exist in tension, but in harmony. Meanwhile, there was also this idea of the gods kind of splitting in a 3v3 sort of thing.
So we spent a good amount of time talking about the process of getting from where we were to where we are, and reframing the gods with and against each other. But now I wanted to talk a little bit about the gods in relation to the champions, what we wanted to get out of the champions and where we were going. How did the idea of the champions come about? And I know some of that. And what did the champions add to the narrative that could not be accomplished by telling these stories through the gods?
Telling a story about immortal beings, about these beings who don't have upbringings the way that humans do, don't have histories. They have histories, they have traumas, they have all these things, but they're not human. And one thing you can do about that is to make them more human, make them less divine. But a different thing you can do about that is let them be divine and have human characters alongside them. And when you said that you wanted marquee characters, I was very excited, in part because making the marquee characters would be fun, but in part because that meant that we got to keep the gods divine.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about our champions and how they relate to the gods. I knew that we wanted to create several relatable characters that people can become invested in, both in the stories that we tell in the meta narrative and with the stories that the players themselves tell through their play during the game.
Relatability is very important to me, and that can be a somewhat dangerous word, but it means a number of different things. One of the things it means is inclusion and good representation, and we worked hard on that angle of it, of making sure that lots of different kinds of people can see themselves in our lineup. But another thing that I think is a real change to how narratives are driven, even just relatively recently, is that even superheroes, even people who are supposed to be awesome and are awesome, can also be flawed. So our champions are literally imbued with the power of gods. This is a fantastical world. They need to be cool and fantastical. But they also need to be relatable, and that can happen in a lot of different ways as far as what their lives look like. So Lysander, I thought about, well, okay, what's light really about? Light is about an order to the universe. Light is about faith. It is about faith in an order to the universe, that things are a certain way and that they should be that way. Or if they're not that way, there's a way that they should be. That to me is the human core of the light domain. I came up with this idea that Lysander was broken, that he had suffered a trauma, that he had suffered a trauma that shattered his faith. So I thought, okay, how can we make this brokenness visual? And I thought back to kintsugi, this Japanese technique of repairing shattered porcelain with gold, that when you repair a thing in the right way and acknowledge its history, you're not trying to hide that it was ever broken. You're trying to say, wow, look, this bowl's been around the block. This bowl has seen some things.
A key way our characters feel human and relatable is that they're facing real things in a fantasy setting. And those real things are expressed in the gameplay, by the way, in the story and in the art. So Lysander was shattered in this amazing moment in the story, but the way we pay that out, in terms of gameplay, he's completely healed every turn.
Right.
You can't just hurt him, you have to end him. And
Right.
because of the powers of the domain of light, that's easier said than done. That's been my favorite part of this process, is to seeing what the game needed and how it oftentimes happened to line up with stories you were writing from 8,000 miles away when we weren't even talking about that part yet.
And I think part of the reason that a lot of that worked as well as it did, game mechanics start from light as a domain and what is light, and I started from light as a domain and what is light. And so it's not a total, it's not a convergence from completely separate places. They
Right.
started in the same place, diverged, and then reconverged.
Yeah, and that happens over and over too.
Yep.
Separate from that, from the origin stories, there's the trials, right? The trials of the gods. So each of the trials are put in front of these champions.
You and I worked on these marquee characters several months prior, and had come up with kind of the broad version of their backstories and everything. And then we'd also come up with these trials for them and how they triumph over those trials, which was a process where I drew on the trials of Hercules, the labors of Hercules, because those are familiar as a group, but many of them are not actually familiar individually. I didn't print from them very directly, but okay, there's going to be monsters to slay or capture. There's going to be objects to retrieve. And so we had come up with vague outlines for the backstories, and then these pretty detailed ideas of these challenges they would face and how they'd overcome them. Then when you came back to me and said, okay, time to actually write the stories, we've already kind of figured out how they'll go. And my response was like, well, I really think it's important to do these origin stories. I think we need to introduce these characters before we just throw them at the trials that we're going to throw them at. And those trials really are told on the cards, that you can see them on the cards, you can see how they unfold, but without being able to put it in the story, you're not going to know Lysander's backstory and how he had his difficult break and his reformation. I thought, how does Oros challenge Lysander? Lysander's a soldier. Like, he slays monsters, he kills enemy soldiers, that's his whole thing. How does the god of war challenge him? And I thought, oh, well, Lysander's thing is, some people need to be killed. I'm a soldier, I do that. Some people need to be fought, and some people need to be protected. And Oros comes at him by blurring that line, by mixing those two groups, by making people who need to be protected the people who are attacking.
So we've done a deep dive on one of the champions, Lysander. I wanted to talk about the other champions, some of which have been revealed, some of which haven't. So walking through that, we'll be a little bit careful. But I wanted to speak a little bit about Neferu, the champion of death.
So part of the big difference between them is their age. Lysander is the oldest of the champions by a lot. He is around 50, a little more than, and his primary interaction in the story about him is with his son. Neferu is much closer in age to Lysander's son, probably about the same age as
Yeah, roughly the same, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 25-ish or whatever. For Lysander, it is all, he gives a speech in his story about what it's about for him. For him, it is about defending a way of life that he sees as as conducive to human good. Anubia is in a very different situation, where the Olympians have been eating away at Anubia's borders for centuries now. That Anubia is our Egypt-esque place, and like the real Egypt, it's been through a lot. It's been through a lot of change. It's been through a lot of history, and by this point, it is somewhat faded from its glory. That the monuments are old, and there's a lot of memories and history. Neferu is deeply invested in Anubia, in being a Nubian, and in the history and glory of Anubia. She's not even there to serve the pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
For her, it's all about her heritage, her history, her people, and her country. For her, heritage is not about what happened in the past. The past glory of Anubia is not about the past. So the real question of that story is like, what does it mean that we have a great history, and what can that history do for us now? How does it help us fight for what's good and right in the world right now?
So the third character that we released is Pallas. They are the champion of magic, and the story you wrote was included the most epic library sorting scene ever
in all of literature. I firmly believe that. Yes.
And that was it was great, and I loved how that story was a very different feeling than the two that preceded it. Pallas chooses their own way. So Pallas chooses their own way with the magic that they perform, and even their own field of study. Pallas performs gender their own way. Pallas is non-binary. Loved where Pallas sits in the story in terms of representation. Some card games have had issues with the representation, both past and present. And I wanted to lean into it, but I didn't want to make it the focus. I just wanted these characters to be awesome representations of themselves in our game world, to be awesome representation for players to see themselves in the game, and I just thought you nailed it.
To me, Pallas's defining characteristic is defying categorization.
The way you described how Pallas wove their magic, and to be very specific here, their magic's plural, manifesting ice as opposed to freezing the water. It
was transmuting water into ice.
Yes, transmuting water into ice. That was the proverbial chef's kiss. I absolutely loved it. Okay, so as we wrap up, I guess the most important question I have for all of this is, what are you hoping that the players take away from what we're doing here? In terms of the cards and the gameplay, that's obvious. I want to make a fun, fair, balanced, gameplay diverse, broad, deep game experience that gives people things to eat into over time to learn and discover. Yeah. What are you trying to get from the story, from your perspective? What's the main, where are you driving for that?
I think that when you have that relatability, that drives a very different kind of engagement that people can really tell the difference of. There was a comment, I don't remember what forum it was in, but there was a comment somewhere on the internet about one of these stories that was like, I'm really enjoying the lore. I'm not able to play very much right now, but this is helping me kind of keep my toe in. This is helping me stay engaged, and that's definitely part of it. That it's something that isn't the game that can engage you with the game. That is a big part of what a card game's lore can do. Is it gives, card games are all about collecting, and it gives you another thing to collect, knowledge and experience and emotion about these things. But more than that, having these human people with their stories, if you've read their story, then when you see that champion's card, or when you see how they face adversity and triumph over it on the cards, that's going to mean something to you emotionally that it wouldn't otherwise. By telling a story about a game, the ways that you can feel about things can get really complicated and interesting, and I love that.
Okay, well, all of this pays off in the end with the meeting in the Grand Arena, and I have it on the screen here. And players are going to find out about that with our expansion, Trial of the Gods, coming soon. And the stories that Kelly is writing and that we're editing and getting up there on godsunchained.com and on our blog and in our lore section. Kelly, thank you so very much for joining us for the stream. And
Thank you.
and thank you all for watching and playing, and we'll see you next time.